I'm on a journey to a world where the impossible becomes possible.
Oh, this is really exciting.
With exclusive access to the world's most impressive feats of engineering.
Wow. It's scale, Richard.
I'll meet desert daredevils.
They'll swing out, they set off the dynamite, then swing back.
And pioneers of land and sea.
I mean, the proportions of these structures are just immense.
Who risked it all.
I'm very aware that there are things out here.
When they picked him out, 5 minutes later, he died.
I'll uncover the secrets of the most extraordinary structures ever built. This time, I'm heading to the tropics.
Actually, that's quite far above me now.
To a superstructure made in one of the world's deadliest environments.
This heavy rain that we have right now makes the whole process more complicated and challenging.
In an epic struggle against natural disasters, disease, and death.
They could not stop malaria and yellow fever because they didn't know what was causing it.
In the battle to build the Panama Canal. At the turn of the 20th century, one of history's most difficult and challenging engineering projects took place here in Central America.
It was a tale of triumph and tragedy, a battle royale between man and nature, and it resulted in one of the 7 wonders of the modern world, the Panama Canal.
Panama is an isthmus, a narrow strip of land, yet it's home to one of the harshest terrains in the world. Wild jungles, raging rivers, and deadly creatures. As early as the 16th century, global superpowers aspired to conquer this hostile land, to build a waterway that would join the world's 2 largest oceans, Pacific and Atlantic, to create a new, lucrative trade route that would bring East and West closer together.
It made perfect sense to construct a canal across Panama. At its narrowest point, it's only 30 miles between the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean.
But this shortcut looked easier on the map than in reality. Mountains would literally need to be moved, rivers tamed, and malarial swamps cleared. But the deadly risks would bring great wealth and prosperity to its conquerors. And it's no wonder. Today, the strategic location of the canal has made it the lifeblood of global trade. Around 14,000 ships transit through here every year, carrying $250 billion worth of cargo. And the whole operation starts here, the traffic control center.
This place is brilliant. My gosh, what's it got going on? Hey, is it Matthew?
Hey, how you doing?
Oh, Matthew, it's very good to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. How you doing?
I'm trying to take this all in. Everyone's screens are all up, people look very busy, there's a lot of action going on.
If the Panama Canal was a body, this would be the brain. So everything is coordinated here. We are in constant communication with the ships. There's a lot of pressure that we do things correctly.
How many ships are there then?
Today we have like 37 ships. The average per day is between 36 to 40 ships per day. When that vessel decides to transit, we put them in the schedule. That's what we're looking at. We're looking at a schedule of all the ships that are going in one direction.
And all these screens at the top here, have you got the whole canal covered with videos?
Yes, we have about 60 different cameras so that we can keep track of the movements of ships throughout the canal from beginning to the end.
I mean, if we picked one ship, for example, what kind of information have we got on it?
Sure, that's the Triton. And we can see that ship on the camera.
That's Triton here?
That's the Triton right there. And that is the biggest ship that transits the canal today.
How big is it?
It says there it's 1,210 feet in length and 167 feet in beam.
That's the width, right?
That's the width. So that ship carries approximately 16,000 containers on board.
And you must have these container ships that are transporting all sorts of different goods from all places in the world going to all other places in the world. If ships weren't able to come through here suddenly, global trade would be in ruins.
Yes.
It's amazing, Matthew. It is so good to see this. You get a sense of just how important this 50-mile stretch of water is to the global economy, to how the world works.
It is. It is. It is.
In the 19th century, the unattainable dream began to look possible with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, an era of huge engineering and technological leaps. One of its significant achievements was Egypt's Suez Canal, which was built by the French. Confident and in high spirits following this success, they turned their attention to Panama. They began digging the canal in 1881, and even though it would be much smaller than Suez, they soon realized that the isthmus was a completely different beast.
You're digging through big mountains, and so the amount of spoil you would have to dig out to make a sea level canal from ocean to ocean was immense. And of course, you also had disease.
Yellow fever and malaria became the biggest obstacles for the French and decimated the workforce.
Even though the French took lots of measures to have sanitation and hygiene, they could not stop malaria and yellow fever because they didn't know what was causing it. It was an incredibly expensive endeavor at that time, and it nearly bankrupted France.
After 8 years of work, the French had only managed to excavate 11 miles of canal. And the human and financial costs were mounting. A staggering 22,000 construction workers had lost their lives, mainly from disease.
And having spent almost $300 million, the company had no choice but to abandon the project.
But where the French had failed, the Americans saw opportunity.
In 1901, US President Theodore Roosevelt came into office and, undeterred by the French failure, immediately set out to take up the colossal project. Roosevelt's mission was to make the United States a leading industrial superpower. And he'd do this by conquering the canal. For the president, it was the most important quest on the American continent.
Before the canal, merchant ships traveling between the east and the west coast of the United States, say from New York to San Francisco, would have had to travel all the way around Cape Horn at the southernmost point of South America, and one of the most treacherous stretches of ocean on the planet. Creating the canal saved 8,000 miles of traveling, and most crucially for the shipping companies, it saved money. Lots of money.
For $10 million, the Panamanian government gave the US permanent control over a strip of land across the country that would become known as the Panama Canal Zone.
The plan was to build a canal at sea level by excavating an enormous 50-mile-long channel from Colón on the Atlantic across to Panama City on the Pacific. And the man appointed to oversee all of this was the American engineer, John Findlay Wallace.
Wallace arrived in Panama in 1904, favoring the original French idea of a sea-level passage to cut through the harsh terrain.
The wilderness of Panama is an incredibly hostile environment, and the canal had to be built through a mountainous, dense jungle. I'm about to head a little way into that jungle to try and get just a small idea of what it must have been like trying to work in these conditions.
I'm traveling along the Chagres River, a part of the canal system that winds its way into the jungle. And it's fraught with danger.
The word Chagres, as in the Chagres River, means crocodile. So I'm very wary whenever we come into the shallows all around here, and I definitely won't be taking a dip. Panama's climate is generally hot and sticky. And you get used to it in a way, but you step into the jungle, suddenly that heat and stickiness ramps right up. The air feels thick, and I'm very aware that there are things out here moving in all this overgrowth. It's a little disconcerting.
Workers had to cut their way right through the jungle to build the canal, and they did so in debilitating heat and humidity, whilst avoiding deep swamps with crocodiles and deadly snakes.
The venom from a coral snake would attack your nervous system, whilst a bite from a 10-foot-long mapana would cause internal bleeding and organ failure. But an even bigger threat was lurking here, one that couldn't be seen or avoided: the deadliest killer on Earth. The Panama Canal was built through one of the most hostile and dangerous environments imaginable. And during its construction, Chief Engineer John Wallace faced the same problems that the French had experienced just a few years earlier. Workers were falling seriously ill. But the cause of this deadly illness remained a mystery.
During the second year of the canal's construction, sanitation experts reported 80% of the workforce had been hospitalized with malaria. And in the rainy season, an even deadlier disease reared its ugly head: a killer infection of the liver called yellow fever. The number of deaths was so high, a train traveled to Cologne every night with carriages full of coffins. The completion of the canal would not be possible without knowing the source of these killer diseases.
For years, it was thought that yellow fever and malaria were caused by bad air from filth and decomposing matter. But one person proposed what was thought of at the time as a very obscure theory, that in fact they were transmitted by mosquitoes.
That was Dr. William Gorgas, who in 1904 joined the canal project as Chief Sanitary Officer. As a survivor of yellow fever and with immunity, Gorgas made it his lifelong ambition to tackle this horrendous disease. He was one of the rare few that believed yellow fever and malaria were transmitted by mosquitoes, which at the time were very recent discoveries. It was Englishman Major Ronald Ross who first made the malaria connection in 1897 whilst dissecting a mosquito. And 2 years later, yellow fever and mosquitoes were linked for the first time. Using this research, Dr. Gorgas came up with a bold and daring plan to destroy every single mosquito within 500 square miles.
Gorgas hired 4,000 men to go throughout Panama and basically drain any pools of water. If they couldn't drain it, they covered it with oil to keep mosquitoes from breeding. Yellow fever patients were isolated. And by doing all of these things, within a year and 4 months, yellow fever was entirely eradicated from the Isthmus of Panama. Malaria was nearly eliminated, to the extent to which from that day to this, it's very rare to have any cases of malaria in Panama, and it's really only something you see in very remote parts of the jungle.
Disease wasn't the only problem that plagued the canal in the early days of its construction. To create a 50-mile-long waterway across the isthmus, around 180 million cubic meters of soil needed to be dug out. But the laborers only had old tools that had been left over by the French a decade earlier. Chief Engineer John F. Wallace needed new machines that could handle the mammoth excavating work that lay ahead.
Wallace brought in giant steam shovels, mechanical excavators that could shift 8 tons of soil in one scoop. But there was a huge flaw in his plan.
The new powerful machines were excavating more rock and soil than could be removed from site. And slowly the work began to drown in the spoil. With pressure mounting from Washington to get things moving quicker, Wallace was fighting a losing battle.
At this rate, the canal would take decades to complete. In June 1905, exasperated and broken, Wallace gave up and resigned as chief engineer. All work came to a halt.
It looked like the US effort was heading the same way as France. Until the arrival of a new chief engineer. John F. Stevens was a bit of a celebrity, known as the best engineer in America. As a railway man, he'd made his name building impossible routes across the USA. He immediately came up with a new plan. The key to getting the canal back on track would be an efficient railway that could move thousands of tons of rubble.
When he was appointed, he came down to Panama, and he saw that having a very good rail system was going to be vital to removing the incredible amount of rock and mud that was needed to dig out the Panama Canal. And so there were a lot of interesting innovations. One was a kind of a boom crane called a track shifter that could lift whole sections of track and move it to a new place, so it didn't have to be done by hand. And another thing that they did was they would use cranes to load the spoil onto rail cars, but these were open-sided with a plow, and so when they were to be offloaded, they would run the plow with the engine from the train, and within 10 minutes, dump all the spoil from a rail car to wherever it needed to be. Massive engineering feat.
With the railway up and running, the excavation work began to move along at pace. But now Stevens faced another menace, referred to as the lion in the path, the Chagres River.
Panama has a tropical rainforest climate with a dry season and a wet season. During the wet season, it can experience a staggering 105 inches of rainfall. As a comparison, the UK gets around 33 inches over a whole year.
The rainy season in 1905 repeatedly caused the Chagres River to flood, and the violent waters destroyed all building progress. Morale plummeted amongst the workforce as they were forced to work in soaking wet conditions. One worker recalled that sometimes you wouldn't see the sun for 2 weeks straight, and in the morning you had to put your clothes on damp because there was no sun to dry them out.
Stevens realized that attempting to build a sea-level canal against the force of the flood-prone Chagres would bring the work to a halt for around half the year, and something had to be done about it.
He had a radical new plan up his sleeve, and its success would rest entirely on the creation of one structure, the Gatun Dam.
Stevens set out to build the largest dam ever created, with 14 gates to help control the flood flows of the Chagres River. The dam would also create an artificial body of water, the Gatun Lake, where more than a third of the ship's journey would take place. And at 26 meters above sea level, it greatly reduced the amount of excavation work needed. Higher than the Atlantic and Pacific water levels, Stevens had to think of a way of getting ships to climb up. He scrapped the idea of a sea-level canal and instead devised an ingenious lock system that could lift ships up to the lake and then bring them back down again.
The original locks in the Panama Canal are an engineering marvel to this day. The lock gates themselves are called miter gates, which is kind of a fancy way of talking about them. Miter referring to the join. In woodwork, it'd be the join, and that's because when the gates come together, they do interlock and form a watertight seal. But what's really especially cool about these is they are hollow inside. So they're built kind of like a ship's hull or like an airplane wing. And so that makes them very light. And so they can be open and closed with a very low horsepower motor. They're balanced very well.
The canal's locks are powered by the Gatun Dam, and over 53 million gallons of water is needed for each ship that travels through them. Stephen's plan required 3 sets of locks. 1 on the Atlantic side, the Gatun locks, and 2 on the Pacific side, the Pedro Miguel and Miraflores set of locks.
This is the Miraflores set of locks on the Pacific side. There are 2 chambers, the upper and the lower. And in true Panama Canal style, when they were built, they were the largest lock chambers ever constructed.
Each ship is led through the lock by a team of locomotives, nicknamed mules. These are some of the workhorses of the canal.
I've come up onto the front of one of the locomotives that helps guide these ridiculously enormous vessels through the locks.
Engines like these have been in use ever since the canal opened.
They run on this rack and pinion system, and you can see that middle rail with all its grooves in it. That provides traction for these geared wheels underneath the locomotives with the teeth that sit in to each one of those grooves and pull the locomotives along.
This ship needs 6 mules to guide it safely through the lock.
Ding, 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 ding from the locomotives. That means we are underway. Here we go. The ship's propellers have just fired up. Oh, this is really exciting.
The mule's job is to keep the ship on course so it doesn't bash into the chamber walls. And with just a few inches to spare on either side of the tanker, this is an incredibly precise operation.
That is amazing. I can't believe they come through here so smoothly. So just behind me here, I heard a splash. There's another one. That's the cables from our locomotive being released from the vessel, and we bid farewell and bon voyage to the Atlantic Bridge, heading off into the Atlantic.
But locomotives aren't the only means of guiding ships through the canal. Some of the bigger locks use tugboats, and I'm about to get a ringside view of one of them. It's a dream come true.
This is really exciting. I've known about the Panama Canal since I was about 5 years old, and I've always just had a kind of fascination with what goes on here. It's a bit of a moment for me, this. How important are the tugboats to the process of getting these huge ships through the locks?
When ships are going into slow speeds, the pressure of the propeller into the rudder is not enough to control the direction of the ship. The ship will depend on 2 tugboats, one in the bow and one on the stern, to keep himself in the middle of the chamber. The whole process is very delicate. Every single moment of the lockage is critical. And see, there are other weather conditions that get involved, right? Like this heavy rain that we have right now, which reduces the visibility and makes the whole process more complicated.
Absolutely.
And challenging
Edward.
at the same time.
Absolutely, Edward. That is not lost on me. This is a very tense period.
Yeah. It takes a lot of training, simulation, and years of experience as well.
This huge gas tanker has come in from the Atlantic side, and after a 20-mile journey along the Gatun Lake, Edward and his tugboat team now face the daunting challenge of guiding it back down to the Pacific Ocean. And to do this, they need to attach tow lines.
So the tug is just approaching the vessel here at the bow of the ship. And when we get there, lines from our tugboat are going to be thrown up onto the bow of that ship. So we've got our chaps down here who are just waiting to release the lines and get them back up there. Actually, that's quite far above me now. Whoa! We're in the middle of a storm. In case you didn't realize, I think the guy down there just said, "Welcome to Panama."
Once the tow lines are in place, the tugboats can now guide the ship into the lock and wait for the water to go down to be level with the water in the next chamber.
Since we came into this chamber, we've dropped about 16 feet, although it actually feels like it might be more. And these tugboats are working all the time. They're phenomenal machines. There are around 50 of them employed by the whole canal. And they're so versatile and so powerful. And in all weathers too.
Experiencing firsthand how the canal works makes me appreciate how clever John F. Stevens' ideas were back in 1906. But there's one place I'm yet to see. It's where the most dangerous construction work took place, and it became known as Hell's Gate. The Panama Canal is one of the world's greatest engineering marvels. But its construction was plagued by disease, death, and poor engineering planning. When Chief Engineer John F. Stevens came aboard in 1905, his new ambitious plan to build a lock system required a massive, unprecedented workforce. With the promise of riches, tens of thousands of laborers from all over the world came to Panama. I've come to the Panama Canal's official library to discover more about the people who made up this vast migrant workforce.
So Orlando, what have we got here?
We have here a database of the Panama Canal Zone employment records from 1905 to 1937. So we have all the records of the people who have been working here.
How important is it that we've got all these records?
This is very important because it's not only an engineering project. It's a project that was made by people. So this is a way where you can link personal history with this engineering project.
And we can access this now. We can have a look at some people who were employed.
Yes, of course we can. For example, last week we had the visit of this guy from Barbados. He knew from his father that his grandfather came for the building of the Panama Canal.
Elkanah Hurdle. So this chap, Elkanah, he was employed as a clerk.
Yes, was a clerk. Yes.
Able to read and write. Yes.
And he was paid $60 a month. That was a very good money for those days.
The workers who came to Panama were housed in purpose-built settlements. Accommodation, schools and recreation facilities were all specially constructed. But the quality of the amenities enjoyed by employees like Elkanah depended on where they came from.
He arrived here in November 1908.
Yes, and he was black.
So there is an item on the form here, colour. So this was segregation.
This was
racial segregation.
The United States had segregation laws that they exported to the canal zone. This was not something that we had in Panama before. So this, instead of going with white and colored, which was what the US called it, they did two different payrolls, silver roll and gold roll. White Americans were paid in American gold, and everybody else was paid in Panamanian silver. And this also reflected in education, access to food, facilities, housing. You would go to the commissariat, which is where people got their groceries and their shopping done, and there was an entrance for silver and an entrance for gold.
So we can see here, Elkanah came from Barbados. Would that have been typical? Would many of workers have come from Barbados?
Yes, around 40,000 people came from the West Indies, and most of them came from Barbados and Jamaica.
40,000?
40,000.
That's a huge workforce.
Yes.
That's really quite powerful, isn't it? Because we've got a photo of Elkanah here. It turns that huge number, 40,000, into something much more personal. You know, here's our guy.
A number became a person.
So the chap who came to ask you about his grandfather, what was his reaction when you were able to pull this up in front of him?
Well, he cried when he saw the images of his grandfather. He had never seen his picture before.
It must have been a huge pride that he was able to take back to Barbados about his grandfather.
Yes, it is. It is. And it's a pride for us also to link histories and go beyond concrete or water. Records to link lives and memories.
By 1907, excavation work on the Lock System Canal was running at full speed. Stevens, exhausted and feeling he could do no more, wrote a letter to Roosevelt, handing in his resignation. His successor, Colonel George Washington Goethals, a US Army officer and civil engineer, would take the canal to the finishing line. But the battle between man and nature was far from over.
When he took over, Goethals prioritized what's now known as the Gaylord Cut. It's the narrowest and the deepest section of the excavation. And the job became a continuous 24-hour operation, with as many as 6,000 men working on site at any given time.
This 9-mile-long stretch of land is where the most dangerous work took place. To remove 76 million cubic meters of soil, workers drilled holes in the mountains and then blasted dynamite inside to create smaller rock pieces that could be carried away by steam shovels. Dynamiting, work mostly done by the West Indians, became the worst job of the whole construction project. Often in the heat, the dynamite would unexpectedly explode, maiming or killing anyone in the way.
This enormous man-made channel is an incredibly impressive sight to behold. But the conditions those men faced would have been horrendous. Not only did they have to contend with the heat and the humidity of the climate here, they would have been surrounded by a cacophony of noise, with constant drilling, steam shovels in operation, as well as frequent dynamite explosions.
There was one sound, however, that no labourer wanted to hear. The sound of a whistle. It was a signal that a landslide had occurred, often burying workers alive. It was a massive problem that had plagued the area since the French excavation effort 2 decades earlier.
The geology around the Panama Canal area is really unique. It's because we have this quite deep layer of clays overlain by these volcanic rocks. And that provides this unfortunate situation where once the supportive structure is taken away from the clay, so for example, digging a great big canal, those clays are really weakened. And where we have those heavy volcanic rocks on top, it creates quite a large overburden pressure, which places a weight on those clays, causing them to slide under gravity.
Despite the extreme difficulties at the Gaylord Cut, by 1911, the canal was starting to take shape. And by 1913, these lock gates were tried and tested for the very first time.
A 400-year-old dream finally became reality when, on the 10th of October 1913, water flowed through the canal for the first time. The world suddenly became smaller, with a ceremonial event that was an impressive technical feat in itself.
There was a temporary dam that had been constructed that had to be destroyed in order to release the water. And in a kind of a very early, dramatic public ceremony that would do Hollywood proud, I think, today, the dam was actually exploded by the president at the time, President Woodrow Wilson, sitting in his office in Washington, D.C. It was done by telegraph. He pushed a key, sent an electric signal down to Panama, which detonated the charge and blew up the dam. I can't imagine what the flood of water must have been like. To have this uncontrolled rush of water out must have been an incredible sight.
The canal took over a decade to finish. It came in at 444% over budget. But the greatest cost was that of human life. Between the French and the American efforts, it's estimated that around 25,000 people lost their lives building the Panama Canal.
The Panama Canal opened on the 15th of August, 1914. And the first vessel to officially transit across Panama was an American cargo and passenger ship called the SS Ancon. From that day, the canal has never looked back. It's grown from strength to strength. But so have the ships. And after 90 years of operation, a drastic change was needed.
In 1914, after decades of toil, the Panama Canal finally opened. And over a century later, John F. Stevens' great engineering marvel has stood the test of time. Even with today's technology, navigating the canal system is no easy feat, not even for the most experienced ship captains and crew. But help is at hand. Before beginning its journey, the captain hands over control of their ship to a canal pilot that guides them through the 8-hour or so transit. It's a job that requires expert knowledge and years of training. And this is where it all happens.
Good morning.
Good morning, Rob. Welcome to our training center.
Thank you very much, Captain. Lovely to meet you. What happens with these ships that are around us?
These are actual 1 to 25 scale of real ships that are out there in the world. These models feel so real to the pilots that they feel they're on the real ship. All those hydrodynamic forces that you would find in the real world, they're right here.
Is there any chance we can get into one of the model vessels you've got here?
Of course. Why don't we take the tanker today?
Let's go on board.
All right.
I'm excited to see
All
this.
hands aboard, let's go.
Every key feature of the canal is to scale in this 35-acre training facility, including the Gatun Lake, the Gaylord Cut, and even the locks. And I can't wait to get stuck in my tanker.
We're going to simulate going in from the Caribbean to the Pacific Ocean. We don't have tugboats here right now.
Yeah.
So we're going to simulate using the thrusters as tugboats.
Gotcha.
The lock ahead looks scarily narrow. And my first challenge is to try to get my tanker into it and not hit the sides.
Are you sure we're going to fit through there?
I assure you we'll fit, Rob. Yes. What we're going to do now, we're going to line ourselves up that direction, and we're going to start going inside. And let's use the bow thruster simulating it's a tugboat on the bow.
Okay.
So move this lever here to number 3.
Number 3?
Yes.
Okay, let's give that a crank.
We're moving the pointy end, the bow, to the left. Very gentle, just nice and easy. And we're proceeding inside.
Amazing.
Good job.
So with all the different maneuvers that are required to passage through the canal, what are the trickiest bits out there?
Some colleagues might say the timing. Let's say there's about 40 ships every day transiting through the canal. If for some reason every ship lost 10 minutes, eventually you'd have at the end of the day 400 minutes. The pilot has to be highly skilled to not only manage ship handling, but also timing.
So it's not just the precision of positioning the ship, it's the precision of timing, because any delays is costing a lot of money.
You got it right on. We have to run the Panama Canal like a Swiss watch.
There is a lot of responsibility you have as the pilot through Panama Canal.
We're an elite group of 300 pilots, highly skilled, highly trained.
In 1999, the canal reached a significant milestone when the United States handed the strategic waterway over to Panama. For the first time in its existence, the global gateway was in Panamanian hands, ending nearly a century of American control.
I believe many people internationally didn't think we'd be able to manage it after it was transferred back to Panama. And for such a small country to contribute so much to world trade, it's a source of joy to be able to contribute to the world in that way. And I think we have a beautiful motto. It's not official, but we always say, we're the bridge of the world and the heart of the universe.
With the keys to the kingdom, Panama soon realized they'd inherited a big problem. There was a limit to the size of ship which could squeeze through the canal.
I'm 3 stories up here at the control tower at the locks, but the ship's bridge is still above me. Hola.
In the last 50 years, the carrying capacity of container ships has increased 1,500%. As the ships were getting bigger, the Panama Canal wasn't, and they needed to react or face losing millions in toll revenue. In 2009, an ambitious $5 billion expansion project began. It involved building 2 new sets of locks, Cocoli on the Pacific side and Agua Clara on the Atlantic. and excavating a bigger and deeper second lane of traffic to double the canal's capacity. It was a huge undertaking and, like 100 years ago, also ran the risk of failures.
It's a very commanding position we have up here, looking out across both sets of locks. What was it that triggered the construction of this new set of locks here?
The canal was going to be transferred from the U.S. to Panama in '99. And at the time, we were pretty maxed out in the original locks, and we were going to lose in relevance if we didn't expand the canal. The biggest container vessel that can go through the original locks can carry 5,400 containers.
Okay.
The biggest one here has brought 16,000 containers. So it was about
It's almost 3 times
scales
as
of
much.
magnitude.
Those kinds of figures are mind-blowing.
About 97% of the world fleet can now fit through these locks, which was not the case before we built the expanded canal.
Were there physical challenges of building this extension so close to the original?
Even though it's so close, it's far enough that there was no impact to shipping, and to us that was very, very key and critical.
What's the main differences between Cocoli, the new extension of the Panama Canal, and the original locks?
We have rolling gates. The reason we have rolling gates is because the miter gates, which is what you have in the original locks,
That open and
they
close
open
like
like
that.
that, right? First, there was no miter gates of that size in the world, so we didn't want to try something that was not out there.
Yeah.
And also, those gates, you need to bring a floating crane, remove them, and take them to a shipyard for maintenance. These ones, you put them in the recess, you put stop locks in front of it, and it becomes a dry chamber, so you do the maintenance on site.
Very clever.
We cannot afford to close this lock because it's only one lane.
I love that. So there's design in there. There's design for maintenance. It's engineering design for maintenance.
Without sufficient water, the canal wouldn't be able to function effectively. But with climate change and Panama's rainfall average slowly decreasing, the need to save water is more critical now than it was in John F. Stevens' day. So, as part of the expansion, water-saving basins were built next to the locks, each basin with the surface area of 25 Olympic swimming pools.
It's very important for us to protect the water because 55% of the population of Panama drinks water from Gatun and Alajuela lakes. So we really need to be cautious with water. So it was mainly for that.
How do you manage that?
So when this vessel comes in,
Yeah.
part of the water that we need to release to bring him down to here
Yes.
will go into those 3 water-saving basins, which have different elevations. 3/5 of the water is saved and 2/5 are released to the next chamber.
So instead of just flushing that water through from chamber down to chamber, down to chamber, as it happens at Miraflores,
Recycle.
and that saves how much water?
60% of the amount of water that a traditional lockage would use.
That's huge.
Yeah.
For over a century, the Panama Canal has provided a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans that we all rely on every single day.
No matter how you live your life, there's a very good chance that one way or another, you are dependent on goods that pass through the Panama Canal. Whether that's the food you eat, the car you drive, or the materials used to build and furnish your house. And it's cargo vessels like this that make that a reality. I can't help but be in awe of the engineers who came up with the solutions to tame this unforgiving tropical wilderness, nor the thousands of workers who battled their way through it, many making the ultimate sacrifice. The construction of the Panama Canal yielded a series of world firsts, world's biggest, and in my opinion, the world's most audacious. The Panama Canal is undoubtedly an engineering masterpiece to behold.
Next time, a major energy crisis.
It's as hard as it gets. It's like working in space.
And a dangerous mission.
When they picked him out, 5 minutes later, he died.
Megastructures.
This is an absolute whopper.
And clever machines.
It was pushing this technology to the very limits of what it could do.
These are Britain's North Sea oil rigs.